What's up, guys? So welcome to my 40-minute biography. So if you've ever wondered how I found Hellenic Polytheism, how I became a pagan, my spiritual background in Christianity, my experiences with spirits and ghosts, I'll tell you all about it if you guys want to check out this following podcast. So this is my first podcast with some images thrown in, just because the camera wasn't really working that great. So I was like, we'll just use the audio and I'll throw some pictures in. So if you're willing to stick it out for 40 minutes, I explain why October is such a big deal in my life, and I give you my full story of how I started off as Christian, became pagan, and eventually Hellenic Polytheist to create my own YouTube channel. All that's in this explanation, in this biography of my life. What's up, guys? So it is October 2025. So October marks a very special month in my life because it was 16 years ago that I first became an official quote-unquote pagan. And so October of 2009, so 16 years. Crazy. That is a long time with a long history that goes behind it. And so to mark the occasion, every October or every other October, I always like to do a video celebrating that, my adult spirituality, I like to call it, because ever since the majority of my adulthood, I would say this has been my spiritual path in one form and another, and that is paganism. And so this video is a get to know me for the ones that have never heard my story before of how I became pagan, my background of where I came from, and how I got to be Pig the Pagan. So it is a long story, so I'm not sure how long this video is going to be, but I do have some notes. So you'll see me looking off to the side, looking at my bullet points I wrote down on my speaking parts of what I want to say and discuss, and some more things may come as I talk as well. So this, again, if you ever want to know about my history of where I come from and how I got to where I am, this is my story. All right, so we will start in the beginning. So I come, as some of you know, my followers that have been around a long time, I come from a very spiritual background. I come from a religious family in the South, and my lineage is of pastors, evangelists, and spiritual people in general. If they weren't in the church, they were involved with the church. Like I said, my dad, who passed away, he was a pastor of a local church for a few years. And then my grandfather was an evangelist and worked in the prison ministries. Mom played piano in the church, and like I said, it was a heavily spiritual involved family, and not just my immediate family, but my expanded family, I guess you could say. We are very spiritual and come from a spiritual place. But with that said, though, some things were peculiar and interesting about my family. My grandparents, I remember as a child that my grandparents would have visions and would hear from God and see things in the future and give advice because they would have dreams and say that this is going to happen. And they had a pretty good reputation. I would say they had a good reputation with that because whenever they had dreams and told people, they would be heard and they would take it under advisement. Whatever the dreams would be, whatever they would say, people would believe it. And so that's been something that's an early memory. So I come from an interesting family in that way too. And so I was raised in a very spiritual environment, we'll say. So I was, from the beginning, always believing in the supernatural and God and angels and demons. We were very heavily in the church. Like I said, we would go to church every Sunday and every Wednesday. That would be my life growing up for years and years, which is a good thing because it helped me accept the idea that there is something more than what we see. And that would also be, like I said, it would make it easier to transition into just the idea of spirituality and that there is more than what we know and can see with our physical eyes. And like I said, whenever it comes to my grandparents, though, whenever people would go get advice from them and they would listen, then they had some pretty good authority on what they had to say. But being in that spiritual mindset as a kid, I had my own paranormal activities, I guess you could say, and experiences way back when I was super young. The earliest spiritual, paranormal, we would say, experience that I had ever had in my life, and again, I've had a few, and would be when I was about 3 or 4 years old. We moved from my hometown, we moved to the city into an apartment. And one night I happened to see at the foot of my bed, and this would happen actually several nights, but there would always be this woman standing at the foot of my bed. And I would always call her, later when I would tell people these stories, I would say she was a witch because she had a black cloak and had a black hood over her face. And I would always see it. And it was one of those things that, and it wasn't like in the cartoons, I always say also, that where you turn the lights on and you're like, whew, because it was just a coat draped over a chair. It wasn't those things. It was more of the flip the lights on and she disappears kind of thing. But that was definitely the one that freaked me out the most. And I always remember running to my parents' bedroom after that would happen. And would you blame a little 3 or 4 year old kid? Now, this other experience I had, and again, I've had a few, and we'll go over all of them, is my mom's favorite because I've told her the story and it involves her parents. So sadly, when I was 6 years old, my grandparents died. And not long after their funeral, I was playing at my parents' house. So where my parents or mom still lives, that we all lived on the same property where we had her house here, and then my grandparents would be down here, we'll say down the road. And there's this long gravel driveway that goes in between the two homes. So I was outside playing, and on top of the hill, because the gravel driveway goes up a hill and then slopes down to my grandparents' house. And I was playing, like I said, and I saw my granddad standing on the top of the hill. Again, mom loves this story because it's just interesting and it's her dad. But he was standing on top of this hill and he saw me. And then what was interesting is that he started walking to their house. I didn't think anything of it because I was 6 years old at the time. I remember I was 6 when they passed. And so his name was Papa, is what I would call him. And he was walking down the gravel driveway to his house. And I was like, Papa, and I was chasing after him when he was like halfway to the house. And I saw him go down at his house. He got to his house and then he went around, like going down to the basement, because when you're looking at their house, their basement where he was actually always stayed was, you would have to get to going through to the left. So you got the house and then camera left, I guess you could say, or whatever direction you go there, and that's how you get to the basement. Anyway, I saw him do that, and then as a kid I followed, and then I went around, and then when I got to the door, I don't know if it's because I realized what was happening or he was gone regardless, but it freaked me out. And I ran home, back up the driveway, back home, and I have never forgotten that. And that has been 30 plus years. Oh man, I'm old. That's been almost 40 years ago, just about. But I have never forgotten that day, though. And that was the last spiritual experience I had as a kid that I can remember, at least. So we moved on through my normal life. I went to school all the way through high school, always raised in the church again, going to church, heavily going to the church on Sundays and Wednesdays. I was a part of the vacation Bible schools. Whenever they had trips, to different events. I was there, I was a part of it. I was super into the church at the time. And though, with that said, I was not a judgmental person, and I would always be open to talk to people. And I noticed when I got to high school, I made friends. They always say it's high school and college, you always got to watch out because that's whenever the devil's going to try to sway you to different ways and stuff. So I did meet some people and I became friends with everybody. I had a lot of friends. And I remember one time that one of my friends had a pentacle ring on his finger. And I asked him, what was that? What does that mean? I was not, again, a judgmental person. And he talked about how the 5 points of the star is earth, air, fire, water, and the top is spirit, and told me about his beliefs of what Wicca is. And it was interesting. It didn't stick, but I thought it was an interesting thing again. And we were friends for years. And I'd actually run into him again years later, and I told him that story. But again, that was my first exposure to something outside of Christianity, because I went to school in a very small town, and church was a big part, and you were either an atheist or a Christian. And that when it comes to Christian, were you Baptist or Methodist and so forth. So anything outside of Baptist, Methodist, and all that, I was not really exposed to at the time. And so, as teens do, they become rebellious, they start questioning things, and that is a good thing. We should question authority. Not maybe rebel against it every time, but at least question, why do we believe things we believe? And I got there when I was about 16 or 17 years old. I went from Christian to the classic spiritual, but not religious. And I was there for about 10 years. I'd say from about 16 to 26, I was spiritual, but not religious. But if you asked me what I believed, I would say that I was a Christian, just not a religious Christian. But all of that changed. I like that. I got my little pen to point and talk with. So all that changed when I was 26. So when I was 26 years old, I was single and living at home. And I realized that if I wanted a girlfriend, that it wasn't going to come to me. I had to actually get out there and start doing some work. And so with that said, when I was around 26 years old, I got online, started getting on these dating sites, and I met someone who I ended up dating for about 5 months, 6 months. But I always remember the third time we talked on the phone. And again, all you witchy people, three is a big number. But the third date, well, I wasn't really a date, it was just a discussion on the phone. She told me that she was a witch. And again, me not being judgmental, I didn't run away. I thought it was interesting and asked questions. And like I said, eventually we ended up getting together for a few months. And in that time, I found out that she had a more Appalachian, however you want to pronounce it and say it, because we are in Appalachia, family tradition of witchcraft in the family. Like her mom was into tarot cards. She showed me about tarot cards, taught me about tarot cards. So in those few months, they were very formative, again, to the idea that there's something else out there. Even though we didn't really end up believing the same kind of things at the end of the day, things I learned, it did take away, were very beneficial. Like, as you know, those that have followed me are into tarot, that know I'm into tarot cards. And so all that started with her, and it helped expand my mind even more. And so it was again the planting of the seeds of what would become the Pagan later in the future. And so, yeah, we decided that we didn't really believe the same thing. She was very guarded about what she would tell me, what she wouldn't tell me. The big thing I remember she telling me is that when she taught me about tarot cards, is she always said that you cannot be afraid to do it, because if you're afraid, then you're not going to get the right advice or reading. And that's something that I've always remembered. But her beliefs, again, were different. Like, she was more of the Christian Appalachian folk, as in tradition, family tradition kind of witch, more than what we would say a Wiccan. She would do spells here and there, and I remember some spells that she would do, like using tobacco on shoes to to try to encourage them to like walk away and never come back, kind of thing. And little things that she's learned through her family through the years. But again, she was more the Jesus is God, because I asked her once, because I was reading a little bit about it, about this idea of a goddess and God. She was more of, she wouldn't say fully, but she would say that Jesus is God and like Mary would be a goddess. So it was more of a Christian folk religion idea. And it was during that time that I picked up and went to Books A Million, which is a store here in America. And I went to their witchcraft and Wiccan section to read more, to see if there's anything that stood out that I could maybe read, because I was interested. And the book that got me into Wicca was the classic Green Book. It was Scott Cunningham's Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. So that book, I bought it and never read it. Bought it, took it home, and my girlfriend and I eventually broke up. I think is the history of events that happened. Maybe, actually, now I think about it, I actually think I did read the book while we were still together, because that's when I started asking her questions about the goddess and all that. But on the book, though, the Guide for the Solitary Practitioner by Scott Cunningham, it changed my life. That made, because when I read that book, like many people say, that book, I would say, was the true beginning of my spiritual beliefs, because it made total sense to me when I was reading it about how there is not just a God, but there is a goddess. So it introduced polytheism to my brain. And I've said it before that I was so hardwired in Christianity and monotheism that the thought of a goddess never crossed my mind. So when I read the goddess and I understood what that meant, that there is a female deity out there, it blew my mind. And I couldn't handle it at the time. It was like a fight. I was fighting my upbringing, with new philosophies and thoughts that I had never considered before. But again, that made me think, wow, there's not only male, but there are female deities out there as well. Again, that would play into what would happen later. And it changed me. And I decided October of 2009. Is it 2009? Yeah, crazy. 16 years again, that I would dedicate myself to the God and Goddess at that time. And that is the birth of this anniversary. It was October 2009, so long ago. And we eventually, my girlfriend and I, broke up. But I do remember the first ritual I did. I remember I went outside, there was a stump of a cut down tree, and I took white candles and some incense and went out there at night and did a ritual and said that this is going to be my new spiritual life. And it pretty much has been for 16 years, variants of that at least. And so, like I said, my girlfriend and I broke up. And when I was on my own, I started wanting to dive more into my spirituality, my new spirituality. So I wanted more people to learn from. And so I went to the internet and went to witchvox.com. And I think that website no longer exists. I know that they discontinued the website a few years ago, but I think it's still discontinued. But back in the day, though, Witchvox was where you would go for articles, and where it was useful for me is that I was able to they had a little thing where you could go search for covens and groups in your local area, and there happened to be one in my local area, which was about 30 minutes from where I lived. And so brave and shy me decided that I wanted to go check out this group since it was just practically down the street, like I said, just 30 minutes away. And I did. And it turned out to be, the group name was Circle of Ravens. And I went and spoke to the head priestess, super nice lady, and I got to talk to her, met her husband, and they became my first coven that I learned from. We would have meetings ever so often. They were very loose. They were a very loose coven. But we'd always get together, have fun, and eat, drink, and then we would go into another room, and that's where we would have our coven meetings of prayers, again, more tarot, and so forth. And I learned some things from there. And she would actually go on to be the minister at my wedding. So she did play a part in my personal life. But they were a very loose group where there was only so much you could learn from them. But she was very talented in what she did when it comes to, again, tarot and divination. I remember one time how we ended up departing and losing touch is she did a tarot reading for me, and she just got really sad and depressed after she did my reading. And then I asked her, because she had to walk outside and smoke a cigarette, I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "You're going to leave us." And I was like, "What?" She said, "Yeah, she was really good, by the way, because she said by July it was either that year or next year, she said, it'll be over. We won't be talking anymore." And she was upset. I was like, "Nah, that can't be." And guess what? Literally July of that year or the next year, whenever it was, we had we had something happen, and it was over. And it's another thing I never forgot. But during this time, before I move on from that, I want to tell you another paranormal story. Probably the most significant, I don't know if it's the most significant, but one of the biggest paranormal things happened to me when I was with Circle of Ravens. So it wasn't too uncommon for me to spend the night. There would be reasons. We'd have a party. We would just go hang out into the late night, like past 1 a.m. in the morning, and I would just spend the night. But there was one particular night that I still remember to this day. So when I would spend the night, especially this night, I remember sleeping on their couch. And when I lay down for the night to go to sleep, I just got this feeling that someone was watching me. You know, you always sometimes feel like someone's staring at you. And I had this feeling, and I couldn't shake it, that someone or something was watching me as I was laying down in the dark. And I had a dream of this guy. He was a heavyset dude with long hair and a beard. And I'm not describing myself. And I had a dream, and he was just looking at me. And he was sitting at the foot, again, because obviously the best place to sit if you're sleeping on the couch is where there's space at the feet. And he was just sitting there just watching me, kind of thing. And I woke up the next morning, thankfully, because if I woke up like 5 minutes after I fallen asleep, I don't know if I could have gone back to sleep. But the interesting part happened next. So I woke up, like I said, I had breakfast with him. They made breakfast, and I told them, I was like, So weird. So I had this dream that this guy was sitting at the foot of my bed, and I described, or at the foot of the couch, and I described what he looked like. And they looked at each other, the head priestess and her husband, as he was cooking, and they were like, "Ah, that's Brian." They said we've had many people spend the night on that couch, and they always tell us that Brian is watching them, and he's just curious. He said, "Don't worry about it." He said he always is. If he doesn't know who you are, if he didn't know you personally, he's just making sure that you're a good guy. And you're not going to do anything because he kind of watches our house. Because Brian used to sleep on the couch. So there's a story behind Brian that's interesting too. I can tell you about Brian because they told me. So Brian was a guy that was a friend of theirs who was homeless. And so well, not homeless, but he didn't have a home at the time. So he would stay at their house for a while. And while he was living with them, that was his couch. And so that from that day forward, I have forever believed even more so in the afterlife and spirituality. And that is 100% a true story because it was something, I mean, it was interesting. And so if I ever needed confirmation on anything after this, then that was the day that it all came together. And I was like, wow, wow. That's all I could say and still think of it. And I will hopefully never forget it because that was something that, again, changed my life and helped me believe again in spiritual and paranormal spirits, ghosts, that kind of thing, because it happened. 100% a true story. And so, like I was saying, sadly we left and departed, went our separate ways. And I think it was 2000 something. No, it had to have been 2013 because I got married in 2012, and Circle of Ravens priestess was the minister again at my wedding. So it had to be 2013. So from 2009 to 2013 ish, I was with Circle of Ravens. And again, on my own, I went to Witch Fox because I took a few months break. And so looked for another place to learn. And I came upon Willow Dragonstone. And Willow Dragonstone is actually a pretty popular name. The priestess there has officiated over events and spoken at events. She has written books, and they were an official real coven. I was not used to that. They had holidays, they had parties, they had esbats, sabbats. They celebrated the full moon, the new moon, the wheel of the year, all that stuff. So this Willow Dragonstone was my true first coven, and with a great head high priestess that taught a lot, and I owe a lot to her. You never would know watching my videos now that I used to be the quiet guy that never said anything. So I really do, I credit to, her name is Dia, for showing me what you can be if you actually truly believe in yourself. And again, I was there for years and years and years. And I learned a lot from Willow Dragonstone. They were interviewed on a documentary, and I'm still friends with some of the members there. But it was during my time with Willow Dragonstone that I started spiritually realizing something for myself. And it's something I knew all along. And that realization was that I'm not a witch. Because there came a time through all these years, and finally one ceremony and ritual during Willow Dragonstone, and they had these elaborate Beltane rituals and candle, circle, spiral labyrinths, wonderful spiritual rituals. But that's what I always connected to, was the spiritual part of paganism and Wicca. I was never really into the witchcraft side of things. And I got to the point of my life where I was just there, and there's just something not meeting what I was looking for. And so And again, it was because I was not a witch. I was not interested in that. I was always interested in the goddess, the god, the spiritual side, the spirits, ghosts, what have you. That was more my interest and focus. And so I decided that maybe I needed to just be solo, at least for a while. And so when I was solo, I was still into paganism. I was looking into YouTube. Podcasts were my best friend. I was listening to, there's a podcast you never heard of because it was gone years ago, but Pagan Hooligans was a podcast I really enjoyed because it was new pagans on their spiritual path, and we were learning together. That was the basis of this podcast. And someone watching this video may have heard of the Pagan Hooligans, but they just one day never made an episode and disappeared into the ether like so many of the creators we love do. But with that said, the Pagan Hooligans, again, this was 2011, 2012, 13 years ago. They mentioned about different gods and goddesses. And so with that said, though, in one episode, they mentioned the goddess Hecate, which is no surprise, really, when you think about it, because Hecate, as some people say, is the quote-unquote goddess of witches. So, to some at least, and the goddess of witchcraft. So really looking back, it wasn't that big of a shock that they mentioned her. But that name, though, out of all the ones they listed, rung a bell. So much so that I started looking into Hecate. I started actually buying books. And she is the one that actually got me going in this direction. I started reading the books again, based on or written on the topic of Hecate. And what would happen is, again, somewhere throughout the years, as I was researching Hecate and had an altar to her and praying to her, I happened to go on YouTube and saw a video that was called something similar to the Hellenic view of Hecate. And it was interesting because, all these years and the outside paganism, the mainstream, all you ever really hear is about she's the goddess of witchcraft, and you see the Wiccan and eclectic pagan view of Hecate. But it was this YouTube video I watched, which was interesting, where, again, it was entitled something similar to the Hellenic view of Hecate. Very interesting, and it brought into the Hesiod side of things, and how she's not just witchcraft, how she is the goddess of so many things and honored by Zeus. And that was the beginning of my path into Hellenic Polytheism officially. I was thinking, wow, I have never heard Hecate from this point of view, which is kind of fun. It's funny when you think about it because she is a great goddess. And so you would think that would be the primary point of view, but sadly, at least over here, that is not the primary point of view you ever see. You always see the Wiccan, the pagan view of Hecate, but not the Greek view. And I would watch that entire thing, and again, it was another turning point in my life. And that's why Hecate is still an important goddess in my life, that she's on my household gods altar. And so I was solo once again, a solo practitioner, and looking for a path, trying to find something, because when I was pagan, or when in my infancy of paganism, I believed in a god or goddess and goddess, and didn't really have any names that stuck. I would always pray to the god, to the goddess, but I wanted to have names to these labels, for lack of a better term. And so Hecate was the goddess that really spoke to me, and I really got into, like I said, reading about her. But I still didn't have a god. And again, because I was in that Wiccan frame of mind, so I was looking for a goddess and god. So I had Hecate, and a god was the one that was the elusive one, the one that I couldn't nail down of who I wanted to pray to or work with, as they say, the term that I don't use anymore, but a lot of people do. So I happened to walk into a thrift store, I guess you say, kind of like a Goodwill, called Restore. Yeah, it was Restore, which is again is a kind of is a Habitat for Humanity store that's kind of like a Goodwill where they have a little bit of everything. And they happen to have Greek vases that had grapevines and grapes on them. And that had me thinking about the god Dionysus. And so that triggered a memory for me that back when I was really young, I have always loved Greek mythology. I remembered that how much I enjoyed that as a kid. I would write stories based on Greek myths. And I was like, maybe that is where I should go and look into. And so I started reading about Greek gods and Greek goddesses, going on Facebook, because Facebook was becoming the place to go and relevant. That was what during the big Facebook boom. And so I joined some groups and started asking questions on the Greek gods and goddesses. And that's where I would meet some people that I would know later in life, like Chris Aldridge. I remember he was a part of a group. V, my good friend V, who would go on to create Hellenic Herald. She didn't have Hellenic Herald at the time. It's kind of funny that this was pre-Hellenic Herald V. But I remember her, we didn't know each other at the time, but as time went on, we've become friends. So, yeah, so interesting and influential people I would meet in these groups and ask questions. And I would go on YouTube looking at videos based on the Greek gods. And I remember years ago, there was Eliakai and Eagle of Zeus. Again, I've mentioned before, Eagle of Zeus, who would go on to be a friend of mine, was influential as well. Felicity. We started around the same time. I won't argue who was first, but Fella Blythe was not around when I started researching and looking into Hellenic Polytheism. I remember it was just Eagle of Zeus and Eliakai were the two big ones and references that had consistent videos and that helped someone like me that had questions. And that's also where I found a video by Psychic Bob on Spirit Channel. Again, the Wiccan pagan view of things, but he had a video on Vesta, which is Astia in Greek, as we know. And he said that she's the general goddess, the goddess that you can approach. And of course, that's 100% true. And so I was like, wow, that would be a good starter as well. And so I started praying to Astia and getting into Astia, Hecate, Dionysos, and looking more into it. I found books and researching gods, I think, certain websites, and I remember seeing the name Apollo, and I've told that story too, how that name stuck out because he was the god of light and truth, and I needed that at the time for sure. And so that just really started praying to them, and everything just clicked, and I just fell in love with the spiritual path. And I knew, as they always say, cliche as it is, I felt like I was at home, and I found where I belong. Thanks to all these things happening, I was like, this is where I should be. And all my prayers were answered when it comes to spirituality. And then a small little epilogue, I guess you could say, about where we are now. So how I picked the pagan is that like I said, I always had questions. I would go to Facebook, I would look up YouTube videos, I would always be asking questions of what about this, what about that, and how about this, how about that. And so I thought to myself, YouTube really doesn't have too much at the time. too many YouTubers really talking about the questions I had. So I thought I would start a channel showing how I do rituals, how I do prayers, answering questions that I've had in my head. I remember I had so many questions that one year of Pick the Pagan that I think I did a video just about every day, at least every other day for an entire year. So there was always some question I had or a question I thought someone might have. And I wanted to be a channel that would, if you ever had a question on how to do a ritual, had a question about what prayer looks like, how to pray, why to pray, do they, does anything offend, and so forth, and you name it. I wanted to have a video on that and talk about that. And so that was the birth of Pick the Pagan. The name Pick the Pagan because Pick is part of my real name, and the pagan just sounded good.
Raise his own rise and sing praises of the gods.